It begins with a sound. Soft, unremarkable, if you're not listening. A ball, tapping pavement. Once, twice, then again. Before the lights. Before the interviews. Before the roaring crowds. There was just this house in Compton. Sun-bleached, not new. And two sisters in the driveway, sharing one ball, one racket, and one dream so big it barely fit between the fences. Behind the faded screen door, their father watched. He said they'd be champions. No one believed him. Not really. Not even little girls are supposed to believe in things that loud. But Venus didn't argue. She didn't beg for attention or cry to be seen. She just played, tall for her age, all limbs like a shadow stretched too far. Her braids clicking like a soft metronome. Eyes fixed, steps certain. The rhythm of the game lived inside her already. Even then, some stories feel like they begin halfway through, when the world finally starts watching. But this began in whisper. She wasn't lightning. Not yet. She was the pressure before a storm. The calm that makes you look up, not sure why your throat feels tight. We talk about Serena. How could we not? She broke through with fire in her stride and thunder in her grip. But Venus whispered first. She showed us that you could be soft and still unshakable. Still dangerous. Sometimes when two stars are rising at once, it's easy to miss who lit the path. Easy to overlook the quieter glow. But make no mistake, this path, lined with trophies and headlines, it started somewhere else. It started in a cracked driveway, with a ball that wouldn't bounce straight, with sirens echoing in the distance, and a girl who didn't need the world to believe in her. Because she already did. And when she stepped onto her first court, the world didn't know it yet, but something had already changed. The courts weren't much. Cracks like spiderwebs ran through the pavement. Fences hung open like tired arms. Sirens wailed at intervals, not alarms, just background, like crickets in other neighborhoods. But here, sneakers scraped across faded lines. And in the heavy Compton dusk, two girls chased a dream disguised as a ball. No one clapped. There were no stands. Only the low shout of a father's voice, sharp, loving, relentless, cutting through evening heat. Venus was the older one. Taller, quiet. Serena chattered. Venus listened. But when Richard threw the ball into the air, Venus didn't hesitate. She served like she meant it. Even then, it wasn't about pretty swings or textbook follow-throughs. It was about hunger, intensity, repetition, over and over and over. Until the dream felt real. Until their city disappeared behind sweat and squeaking shoes. Some watched from porches. Others shook their heads. No girls from here ever make it, they mumbled. But Richard had a vision. Not a hope. Not an idea. A vision. He didn't coach them for fun. He taught them like lives depended on it. Because, in a way, they did. Because tennis, of all things, was going to be the door. Venus didn't challenge that dream. She folded herself into it. And yes, she smiled sometimes. But mostly, she worked. She was 7, maybe 8, but already held herself like she'd seen things. Like she knew greatness wasn't loud, just deliberate. When Richard spoke of Wimbledon, no one believed him. Not even some in the family understood. Because from this cracked court in Compton, England sounded like fiction. But Venus didn't ask where it was. She didn't laugh at the idea. She just nodded, as if Wimbledon were already waiting for her. The wind picked up sometimes and the net would flutter. The paint would chip. The neighbors would stop watching. But Venus kept swinging, with her sister beside her. With a racket not quite the right size. With beads in her hair and discipline stitched into her day like sunrise. It was practice, yes. But it was also protection. Out there, things could be dangerous. Shootings, sirens, judgment. But on the court, they controlled something. Their movements, their breath, each swing, a choice. Venus didn't announce she would win. She didn't promise anyone anything. She just kept showing up. Kept hitting ball after ball into the fading light, as if shaking hands with the future. Again and again. And though the street lights flickered on, and though the rest of the world turned to other things, in that backyard turned battleground, a legend began to take her shape. Her hair was braided, tight, purposeful. Beads clicked with every step, every serve, like a song only she could hear. They weren't decoration, they were declaration, because Venus never shouted. She never needed to. The beads spoke for her. In a sport of neat polos and neutral tones, she arrived like jazz, unapologetic, unpredictable, brilliant. And people didn't know what to make of it. Not really. She was tall, unusually so for her age. Every limb looked stretched, like her body was trying to grow faster than time would let it. But there was grace in the awkwardness. That odd elegance you only notice when the silence gets loud. Adults squinted. She didn't fit the mold. And that made them uneasy. She was not just black. Not just powerful. Not just from Compton. She was serious. Not showy. Focused in a way that didn't perform for cameras or conform for comfort. Some said she was cold. Others called her robotic. Quiet, distant, puzzling. But they missed the point. They missed the discipline. They missed the fire folded neatly inside her stillness. Because Venus wasn't here to entertain. She was here to win. And if she had to teach the world dignity one tournament at a time, so be it. The beads were part of that story. Part culture. Part armor. Part beat of the rhythm she played to. Girls watched her and saw themselves. In the way she walked. In the way she didn't shrink. In the way she took up space, politely, powerfully, as if it were hers all along. And it was. For them, she was proof. That quartz could belong to them too. That poise was power. She didn't trade her voice for acceptance. She didn't soften her edges. She didn't care if the world wasn't ready. Venus showed up anyway. And when the cameras finally began to turn toward her, they lingered, unsure what they were watching. Not flash. Not fury. Not brilliance wrapped in performance. Something quieter. Something steadier. She didn't smile unless she wanted to. She didn't break character because this wasn't a character. This was who she'd always been. Even with beads clicking, even with critics whispering, even with barriers rising like fences. Venus stood tall. She didn't ask if she was allowed. She just walked out, took her place on the court, and let the game speak for itself. There were whispers, soft and skeptical, winding through the tennis academies of Florida. A girl from Compton? With beads in her braids and silence in her answers? But then Coach Rick Machi saw her. They say he watched her warm up for less than 10 minutes before he knew. Not just that she was good, many were. But that she was inevitable. The way she moved, the posture, the quiet, the fire disguised as rhythm. She didn't talk much, didn't ask questions. She just returned ball after ball with a calm ferocity that made coaches lean forward in their chairs. Rick called it poetry. He said she moved like a melody you couldn't write down, only feel. Venus wasn't showy. She didn't do trick shots. She didn't yell, smile, grimace. She focused. Every swing with the precision of someone twice her age. Machi saw it. Richard already knew. The rest of the country had yet to. Florida was a different world from Compton. But tennis? Tennis felt the same. Lines were still lines. Serves still sang across the strings. And Venus? Venus didn't shrink in the glare of palm trees and polished quartz. She absorbed it, adapted, but never changed. She wasn't alone anymore, not entirely. Other girls wore new shoes, clean jerseys, names stitched in big brand letters. And still, Venus placed her game quietly on the same shelf. Not asking for room, just earning it. A reporter once asked her what she was thinking during matches. She said, "Nothing." It wasn't empty. It was full of muscle memory and instinct, full of hours spent chasing cracked balls in cracked driveways. She didn't play with her thoughts. She played with her bones. But fame doesn't arrive gently. It doesn't knock first. It barges in, cameras, contracts, promises in sharp suits and long vowels. Venus was just a teen. Still stretching, still studying, and already they were calling her the next big thing. They wanted her to speak, to sparkle, to sell, but she gave them silence. Gave them games. Gave them wins and walkaways. Some didn't know what to make of it. This genius in slow, steady motion. This prodigy who refused to play along. But Rick Machi knew. Richard Williams knew. And Venus? Venus just kept serving, not to impress, but to make truth undeniable. There were still battles ahead. Still ceilings above her. But on these courts, in this moment, with every perfect backswing, Venus had started to haunt the future. And it would never forget her. It was 1994. The world was louder than she was. Cameras blinked. Microphones leaned in. Reporters scribbled into pads that already held her name. She hadn't won anything. Not yet. But she had arrived. And that, somehow, was enough. Venus stood at the net, 14 years old, body still sorting itself out, face calm in a way that unsettled people. Not nervous, not smug, just there, present. The racket didn't look too big in her hands anymore. It looked like it belonged. Like it had been waiting for her. The other side of the net held a seasoned pro. Years older, worlds older. But Venus didn't flinch. She lost. The match was over in 2 sets. No dramatic comebacks. No cinematic finale. But no one noticed the winner. They were watching her walk back across the court. Shoulders set, gaze forward, jaw loose but unshaken. She didn't cry. She breathed, bottle in hand, steps measured, as if she was already rewinding the match in her mind, storing it, learning from it. The reporters circled like moths. They wanted a quote, a headline, a moment, but Venus gave them nothing dramatic. Just a few words, delivered the way she played, steady. No apology, no indulgence, no regret, because for Venus this wasn't failure. This was entry. She'd stepped through a door that most never reached. And even in loss, something in her posture suggested she wasn't a visitor, she was home. Richard stood nearby, arms crossed but smiling. He knew. He always had. This was part of the plan. Not just for victory, but for longevity. Venus wasn't chasing a trophy. She was becoming the kind of athlete who outlasts trophies. The kind who changes how victory is defined. That day, someone asked if she was disappointed. She looked at them, not confused, but bemused. Because they saw what happened. But she saw what was coming. Her game wasn't polished yet. Her serve wasn't fastest. Her footwork wasn't perfect. But there was something else. Something they couldn't factor into stats. That poise. That stillness. They thought grace only came with winning. Venus taught them otherwise. And while the headlines moved on, while the tour welcomed the next name, she went back to practice. To quiet. To rhythm. Because she knew the noise was temporary. But legacy? Legacy grows in silence. The questions started to come as soon as the headlines did. Why doesn't she smile more? Why does she pause before speaking? Why so serious? They wanted charisma, bright sound bites, easy banter. Venus gave them stillness, thoughtfulness, rehearsed calm, not because she wanted to be guarded, but because she already felt watched. Every word, a calculation. Every glance, misread. If she blinked too long, it was shyness. If she didn't blink at all, it was arrogance. She was 16, maybe 17, and already, the world wanted more than her game. They wanted her story, but only if it could be trimmed, folded, made neat. Digested easily. Venus did not bend. She didn't give them the version they expected. No sobs. No hero monologues. No polishing down her edges to fit a headline. She just played. And when the interviews came, she answered softly. Briefly, enough to not be mistaken. But not enough to be claimed. They said she was aloof. Too private, too distant. But who gets to decide how much of herself a girl owes the world? Venus could have played the game off the court. She could have smiled more, let them think she was grateful to be there. Sacrificed truth for favor. But instead, she held her own silence like a shield. Because silence, in her case, wasn't empty. It was strategy. It was survival. Every question she didn't answer? That was its own reply. That she would not perform comfort for people who saw her difference as defiance. Coaches noticed. Commentators guessed. They called it mystery, but it wasn't mystery. It was margin. It was space she carved out so she could keep breathing. Venus had grown up knowing what people said about girls who were too quiet, too strong, too certain. She knew her presence made people whisper. But Venus never whispered about herself. She let the game speak. Let the record hold its own argument. And in a world that begged her to speak louder, smile bigger, package herself smaller, she stayed composed. And still, she won. Again and again. No entrance music. No exclamation points. Just still water running deep. She didn't need to talk about her seriousness. It lived in her serve. She didn't need to explain her silence. It had already been misunderstood. And maybe that, too, was part of the lesson. That not every legend needs to roar. Some just arrive, and stay, with grace sharp as a blade, and quiet taller than most people's applause. Serena was fire, not just in the velocity of her serve, but in the way she moved through the world. Louder, bolder, burning every room she entered. Venus was different, not lesser. Not quieter in worth, just quieter in heat. She watched first, thought first. She let others speak, and then followed, calm, certain, necessary. The world loved to compare them. Was it Venus or Serena? Who burned brighter? Who would win more? But that question made no sense inside their story. Because Venus never needed to win at Serena's expense. And Serena never needed Venus to lose. They weren't rivals. They were co-architects. In hotel rooms, on dim-lit practice courts, through windows of speeding vans. They trained together, not side by side, soul by soul. They finished each other's swings, not just sentences. They passed rackets back and forth like torches, shared meals, shared sweat, shared dreams. And through it all, Venus made space. She was the one who broke barriers first, who stood tall when cameras didn't yet understand what they were seeing. She reached finals before Serena did. She faced questions Serena would never have to answer because Venus already did. When the spotlight shifted to Serena, as it should have, as it needed to, Venus didn't flinch. She cheered. She clapped. She smiled from the stands, from the locker room, from the other side of the court. Not because she disappeared, but because she loved. Enough to let Serena shine. Enough to never need to outshine her. Some siblings compete. Venus and Serena, they complemented. And when they played each other, not often, but often enough, there was no enemy across the net. Only a mirror. There were tears sometimes, but never resentment. Because each victory was within the family. Each loss stayed in safe hands. They weren't just sisters. They were witnesses to each other's becoming. Venus knew Serena's beginnings, messy, magical, full of promise, because she was there for every chapter. And Serena rose as she did because Venus made it possible. With grace, with patience, with the kind of love that knows when to step forward, and when to step slightly aside. But only slightly, because Venus wasn't behind, she was beside, always, forever. Not shadow, not echo, not background. But base, foundation, first light in the morning. And there, in their twin-shaped orbit, one blazing, one beaming, the game changed forever. Wimbledon wasn't just a tournament. It was myth. Ivied walls, royal boxes, whispered histories written in chalk and dew. For most, just walking those grounds is enough. For Venus, it was a beginning long promised. The year was 2000. The air thick with waiting, grass trembling beneath purposeful steps, and Venus, braids shining in the pale English sun, moving as if the court had been waiting for her. And maybe it had, because when she played that summer, she didn't just win. She arrived, not with screams or stomps or thrown fists, but with limbs swinging like clockwork, timing so perfect it felt predestined. Some called it a surprise. Others claimed it was overdue. But Venus? She didn't say much. She held the trophy like she was holding something sacred. Even in victory, her face was steady, not blank, but full of something quieter. Fulfillment, reflection, maybe even awe, because winning Wimbledon was never just about tennis, not for her. It was validation, that Compton had yielded queens. That rusted fences could produce champions. That a dream chased alongside sirens could settle, one day, into applause. She came back the next year, too. And won again. Not through dominance alone, but through understanding. She read opponents like poems, each swing an annotation. She played with elegance mistaken for ease, as if grace grew from her fingertips. And beneath the whites and rules and rituals, Venus kept being wholly herself. Unafraid to say little, unafraid to say, mine. She wasn't trying to be the next anyone. She wasn't measuring herself against history. She was creating it. With every step across that impossibly green grass, she claimed space not just for herself, but for every girl watching who needed proof that greatness could be quiet, could look like them, could begin anywhere. But even as the trophies stacked, even as center court grew familiar, Venus never showed off. She simply stood, tall, complete, still, and that was the power. That somewhere so far from Compton, in a place once considered untouchable, she belonged. Maybe always had, because sometimes royalty isn't given, it's remembered. Even swans swim alone. Fame doesn't always come with celebration. Sometimes it whispers isolation. Sometimes it arrives with applause in one hand and emptiness in the other. Venus was everywhere. Magazine covers, runway shows, billboards, sports shows dissecting her matches, paparazzi outside hotel lobbies. And still, she felt far from home. She crisscrossed the globe, packed and unpacked her life into a suitcase. New cities blurred into corridors of airports, into the muted gray of hotel rooms waiting in silence. She'd won Wimbledon twice, the US Open, doubles titles next to Serena's grin, millions in endorsements, crowds cheering her name. And yet, when the lights dimmed, when the ribbon of victory curled back into storage, it was just Venus again. Soft headphones filling the silence. Waiting rooms, stretch sessions, the ritual of being ready for the next thing before you've even had time to feel this one. That's the part no one tells you. That winning doesn't insulate, it isolates. That being on top means peering down into a world that doesn't always see you as real. There were mornings her body ached. Not with injury, always, but with heaviness. Of expectations, of schedule, of needing to prove again what she'd already proven 100 times before. And there were questions. How long can she do this? Is Serena the better one? Is Venus still hungry? She didn't respond. She showed up. On clay. On hard court. On grass. Through interviews and pressers and matches that barely received coverage. She stood quietly in the winner's circle and even more quietly in defeat. But loneliness still crept in, even in crowds. Especially then. Because who do you talk to when everyone's already decided who you are? She missed Compton, sometimes. The sound of a ball bouncing on uneven pavement. The tight click of her beads. The familiar bark of her father's coaching. There was comfort in difficulty back then. The dream was far, but the love was close. Here, dreams were close. But love felt far. Nobody teaches you about winning like this. About the silence that can follow your name. About how glory makes things better, but not always easier. Venus never asked for pity. She never asked for more. She just kept practicing, kept playing, kept walking onto courts in cities she couldn't pronounce years before. Because in the stillness, in the hum of loneliness and the echo of her own breath, she remembered something. That you don't fight to be seen when you already know who you are. You don't chase noise when your quiet has power. So yes, she missed home. Missed being a girl with nothing to lose. But she was also the woman who'd already changed the story. And sometimes, that's a heavy crown to wear alone. It started slowly. Not with pain, not with headlines, but with a kind of fog. A heaviness in her limbs. A breath that didn't fill all the way. Matches ended, and she couldn't remember stretches of them. Her body, once her instrument, felt out of tune. She'd always controlled it so well. Her movement, her breath, her pace. Everything timed, precise, trusted. Now it betrayed her, and she didn't know why. Doctors ran tests, then ran more. Salt in her mouth, light-headed mornings, fatigue that didn't go away with sleep. An athlete's body, designed for power, felt tired after a walk. It took time before there was a word. Sjogren's, an autoimmune disease. Invisible, unpredictable, unrelenting. For anyone, it would be cruel. For an elite athlete, it was almost mocking. A condition defined, not by what it attacked, but by what it stole. Energy, clarity, strength. She didn't make a scene. Didn't hold a press conference. Just stepped back, quietly. People speculated. Where had Venus gone? Was she done? They didn't understand. She was learning to live inside a new body. One that didn't always agree with her plans. One that turned everyday routines into trials. She felt ashamed, sometimes. Ashamed of needing rest. Of not being able to finish practices. Of not claiming matches she once won blindfolded. But even in that shame, she refused surrender. The court was still hers. So she adjusted, changed her diet, changed her training, changed her sense of what strength meant. Not fewer expectations, just different ones. She came back, not blazing, all fire and lights. But slow, intentional, backhand steady, legs burning, and still, there. Fans didn't rush back all at once. Analysts weren't sure what to predict. But Venus didn't ask for belief. She asked for space. To play, to try, to stay. Because resilience doesn't always sprint. Sometimes it limps. Sometimes it sits. Sometimes it asks for help. She began to speak about it, softly at first. About autoimmune illness. About fatigue. About listening to your own body instead of yelling at it. And just like that, quietly again, she became something else. Not just a champion, but a voice. For the ones playing anyway. Living anyway. Fighting anyway. She hadn't planned to be a face for invisible struggle. But she didn't need to plan. She just needed to keep showing up. And she did. Not every match was perfect. Not every match was painless. But every match was hers. And that, after everything, was the win. It wasn't about tennis anymore. Not solely, at least. It was about presence. About showing up in a world that had already made conclusions. About proving that power doesn't always come in the shape people expect. Venus kept walking onto courts, quiet, measured. She wasn't always the favorite now. Wasn't the youngest. Wasn't the one reporters pointed their mics toward first. But she showed up just the same. Because that's what strength looked like now. Not smashing records, but rewriting the definition of resilience. Not returning serves at 130 miles per hour, but returning to herself, after illness, after doubt, after the kind of quiet that could swallow a person whole. She played, stretched, lost, won, traveled, not to prove she was still a contender, but to remind herself that this was still hers. The game, the ritual, the space to be fully herself, even when her body shifted under her. She didn't collapse under the weight of a diagnosis. She adapted to it, changed what ready meant, let herself slow down enough to listen, and then, softly, surely, began to speak about what she knew now. That strength isn't volume. It isn't perfection. It isn't never being tired. It's choosing, every day, especially when no one is watching. And girls, women, saw it. Saw her shoulder the silence. Saw her move through matches like a woman reclaiming her story, not asking for sympathy, just clarity. That athletes can get sick, can sit out, can rise again. That visibility doesn't have to vanish with vulnerability. Venus became something else then. Not just the first, but the returning. Not just the champion, but the consistent. A lighthouse. For those navigating their own fog. She said less and meant more. Wore her calm like a crown. Didn't force comebacks to be fairy tales. Just made space for them to be human. Because even when she wasn't winning, she was modeling something far rarer. The art of staying, and that's what real power is. To still be here, to still love what almost left you. To lace up again, even when no one expects you to. To choose grace over glory. And to realize, eventually, that grace is its own kind of glory. It wasn't loud, no banners, no televised speeches, no crowd chanting her name. Just a room in Wimbledon, dim and wood-paneled. A long table, people in suits, and Venus, in white, calm, unblinking. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She asked one question. Why are women still paid less? Not angrily, not rhetorically, just clearly. It was 2007. She had already won this tournament. Had already stood on center court with the trophy in hand. And still, the prize money didn't match. They told her things. Things about tradition. Things about viewership. Things that sounded like math but were actually excuses. Venus listened. Gave them silence. Because sometimes silence is the surest way to let others hear how wrong they sound. She spoke again, gently. Said that equality wasn't a favor. Said that what women did on court deserved to be valued the same. Said that history doesn't change on its own, it must be challenged. Reporters didn't quite know how to spin it. No scandal, no outrage, just grace asserting itself. Some called it brave, others called it overdue. Venus called it necessary. She had faced opponents with stronger arms. Had stood across the net from legends. But this was different. There was no racket, no scoreboard, just a table. A promise, a truth. In the end, she didn't argue. Didn't beg. She just made it impossible to look away. And then, quietly, Wimbledon changed, matched the prize money, balanced the scales. They said it was progress. Some even forgot who helped carry it. But Venus didn't need credit. She didn't do it for headlines. She did it because dignity isn't something you win. It's something you declare. And defend. And sometimes, courage looks like a girl from Compton, walking into an English boardroom and asking the oldest institution in tennis to do better. And getting it done. No slams. No headlines. No magazine covers with glowing praise or breathless interviews. Just flight itineraries. Practice courts. Matches scheduled early, ended earlier. Venus kept showing up. Her rankings dropped. Commentators forgot how to pronounce awe in her name. Analysts spoke of legacy instead of momentum. Some said she should retire. Said she'd done enough. Said time had passed her by. But they didn't understand, this wasn't about time anymore. It was about presence. About choosing to stay, even when the room forgets you're still in it. She walked slowly now, more carefully. Her body had changed. Her life had changed. But some part of her still believed in the court. Still believed that between those white lines, she was most herself. Even if winning wasn't guaranteed. Even if headlines didn't follow. Even if applause came in polite spurts instead of roars. She still had rituals. Still packed her own bags. still stretched by herself on quiet mornings while the rest of the tour buzzed ahead. Consistency wasn't glamorous, but it was holy. In those quiet years, she gave more than she ever had. More grace, more patience, more self-awareness. No new trophies? Maybe. But she gave women permission not to leave too soon. To stay, without apology, past their prime and still whole. Still worthy of being seen. She made room, not for nostalgia, but for continuity. She didn't chase the past. She carried it, wore her history gently. When asked what kept her going, she just smiled. Small, soft, unbothered, as if the answer lived beneath the noise. Because what they called decline she called devotion. And each time she laced her shoes, each time she stepped into the sun, each time she walked toward the baseline without a camera flash waiting, she reminded us, glory isn't always bright. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just showing up anyway. Still moving, still remembering who you are, when no one else does. She had always created on the court. Angles, timing, movement choreographed like whispers between wind and earth. But now, she began creating elsewhere, with fabric, with texture, with vision. V-Star was born not in a boardroom, but in a feeling that spaces shape how people exist inside them. That beauty could still come from functionality. That design, like tennis, was about intention. She sat at tables, asked questions. Not about profits, not yet, but about purpose. What does a home feel like when it's honest? What does power look like when no one's wearing a jersey? Her voice, once reserved, found a new rhythm. Not loud, not needing to be, just clear, just hers. And then came 11, not just athleisure, a declaration that women, athletes, daughters, professionals, dreamers, deserved to feel strong in their skin, in their sleeves, in their stillness. She poured herself into seams and fit tests, approvals and redesigns. Said no when something didn't feel right. Said yes when it felt like truth. This wasn't a side project. It was an extension of every match point, every refusal to quit, every quiet moment when she'd chosen herself. The world had always seen her as the competitor. But there, in sketchbooks and sample rooms, she was a builder. Venus wasn't making clothes. She was making space. For women to run, stretch, stand tall, without shrinking. Without compromise. 11 wasn't just a number. It was a mindset. To go beyond 10. To expect more. From fabric. From form. From the world. And through it all, she never stopped remembering where she'd come from. The cracked court. The silence. The song of the beads. Now she was threading those beats into something new. Because the greatest athletes don't just play. They expand. They take what they've learned in motion, about effort, grace, precision, and turn it into something that moves others. So while titles faded, photos aged, the designs stayed. Strong lines, honest textures, power by design. She didn't leave tennis behind. She translated it into rooms, into runways, into something women could wear and say, I belong here too, because she always had. And now, through her work, they could feel it too. It took 14 years. That's how long it had been since that afternoon in Indian Wells. The one that no one forgets, but few fully understand. 2001. Venus withdrew minutes before a semifinal match against Serena. Knee injury, they said. And the crowd, already skeptical, already stirred by whispers of match fixing, turned. Booed her when Serena walked onto the court. Booed them both in the final. Venus, in the stands, sat still and watched. The sound was sharp. Not like sports disappointment, but like something deeper. Directed. Personal. They didn't forget the color of her skin. They didn't hide the vitriol. It cut. Sharp enough to leave a scar. And so she left. For 14 years, she didn't return. No interviews about it. No campaigns. Silence again became her sanctuary. People asked, later, why she didn't come back. Why she let one moment define her relationship with a tournament. They didn't understand, it wasn't the tournament. It was the wound. Because it wasn't just booze. It was betrayal. It was watching an entire stadium tell her, you don't belong here. But time passes. And healing doesn't always ask permission. In 2015, she returned. No press conference. No statement. Just her name on a bracket, quietly. And when she walked onto that court again, the same court that once held so much cruelty, she didn't look back, didn't wave, didn't ask for anything. She just stood there, tall, calm, present. Some fans cheered, some stayed quiet, but the echo was different now. Less accusation, more reverence, not because they forgot, but because she didn't let it define her. Forgiveness had taken a shape. Not loud, not grand. Just a return, a choice. And that's what dignity looks like. Not erasing the past, but standing within it, and saying, I'm still here. Some wounds don't close completely. They just stop bleeding, but Venus walked that court anyway. Not because she needed peace, because she already had it. She returned for herself. For the girl who once sat in the stands trying not to cry. For the woman who knew her silence wasn't surrender. And in that return, there was something larger than redemption. There was wholeness. Because showing up, again, after heartbreak, that's a different kind of victory. And no trophy was needed to prove it. There was a shift you could feel, even if you couldn't name it. Venus still played, but it wasn't about records anymore. Not rankings. Not legacy debates on sports shows between commercial breaks. Not even Serena. It was about space. Not the kind measured in square footage, but the kind you carve out just by continuing to exist. Gracefully, quietly, unshakably. She wasn't chasing a perfect ending. Was never interested in the swan song. That was never her music. Because Venus had already taught us everything. Taught us how to enter softly and still make history echo. How to protect your heart with silence and your future with presence. How to lose, not just matches but strength, time, rhythm, and keep showing up without apology. She kept wearing her 11 gear. Kept signing up for tournaments. Kept lacing her shoes like nothing owed her anything. And the world? The world began noticing again, not because she demanded it, but because time, finally, caught up with her truth. Young players now said, I watched Venus. Not just for her tennis. But for her poise, her patience, her staying power. She wasn't just an icon. She was a rhythm, a measured beat, still in motion. Reporters asked what she was still doing out there. She said she loved it. Simple as that. Some called it stubbornness. But love often looks stubborn to people who've forgotten how to hold on to things. She'd smile sometimes, those soft, knowing smiles. The kind you give when someone asks a question you stopped needing the answer to years ago. Because she didn't need the camera anymore. Didn't need to prove she belonged. She was past that. She had become part of the court itself. A living thread stitched into the net's hummed anticipation. The breath before a serve. The hush between points. And for those listening, really listening, her story was still unfolding. Not loudly, but gently, deliberately, like a final bow refusing to end the performance. Because there are no final acts for people who live their lives as invitation, for grace, for courage, for continuance. Venus was never closing a door. She was holding it open. For all of us. She had always been more than a tennis player. But now, the world began to understand how much more. Off the court, Venus kept building. Not with noise, but with legacy. Not chasing spotlight, but creating foundations. She sat on panels. She led conversations. About equity. About representation. About the responsibility and the cost of being first. But she didn't talk at people. She invited them in. With that calm, steady presence that carried weight, not because it demanded attention, but because it had nothing to prove. Her businesses grew. 11 expanded. V-Star designed homes, hospitals, headquarters. She advised boards, filed patents, supported women, quietly, consistently. And still, she played. Sometimes in front of half-empty arenas. Sometimes in matches that didn't end her way. Because Venus had stepped into something deeper. She had become time-proof. No hot streaks. No viral moments. Just a woman rooted, living with the kind of clarity that doesn't bend for the moment. You could see it in how she moved now. Measured, reflective, like someone who had made peace with all the versions of herself. The girl in Compton, the teenage phenom, the global icon, the woman rebuilding. And maybe that's the kind of victory we rarely notice. The one where you no longer chase the person you used to be. The one where you stop needing to outrun your shadow and start walking with it. There were younger players now. Quicker, louder, brilliant in ways that deserved their own light. Venus didn't compete with them. She congratulated them, mentored them, showed them, without ever saying it, what endurance really looked like. Not staying on top, but staying true. She never gave a farewell speech. Never demanded an ovation. Because Venus never left, she simply started rising in ways we weren't taught to look for. In business meetings, in mentorship calls, in moments of silence where courage gathers. The headlines moved on, the rankings reshuffled, but Venus remained, rooted in her love for something larger than any stat sheet. Because some legends aren't defined by their fronts, but by their staying, not burning out, but burning steady. And in a world obsessed with what's next, Venus became the master of now, of staying present, of knowing when to speak, when to move, when to just be. And that's what made her rare. She didn't just inspire, she endured. There's a kind of peace that settles when you stop needing to be everything for everyone. Venus found that peace quietly, without a press conference, without a season finale. There were fewer matches now. Fewer headlines. Sometimes, just her name on a draw was enough to spark conversation. She's still playing? But that question missed the point entirely. Because Venus wasn't trying to reclaim a crown. She had already worn it, grown out of it, and handed it to others with grace. Now, when she stepped onto the court, it wasn't to silence doubt. It was to keep a promise to herself. A promise to honor the game that taught her discipline, taught her dignity. To honor the version of herself that had trained in the Compton dusk, serving into a future only her father dared believe in. Matches weren't about titles anymore. They were about rhythm, about still feeling the ball sink into the sweet spot. About breathing in that quiet just before a serve. About knowing she still could. Sometimes she won. Sometimes she lost early, and sometimes neither mattered. Because her presence, here, now, still, was the story. Young players walked past her in the locker room, wide-eyed. Not because she was intimidating, but because she was history, walking the same halls they now called theirs. And Venus? She smiled at them, gave them space, gave them the room she never had. She wasn't clinging to the game. She was releasing it slowly, lovingly, like a song you hum even after the final note. She had other things now. Meetings, investments, collaborations, a studio filled with swatches and sketches, a company run with integrity instead of noise. But still, the court called to her, not like it once had, but gently, like a memory asking to be remembered properly. So she kept showing up. Not because she needed relevance. Because she respected the roots. And in those simple moments, tying her shoes, walking to the baseline without fanfare, she reminded us what grace looks like when it's worn in. Not performative, not polished for show, no longer defensive, just lived in, steady, known. The commentators kept waiting for her final match. Kept trying to name the exit. But Venus never needed the last word. She had said everything already, in movement, in stillness, in every choosing to stay. And if her story was now written in smaller chapters, confined to earlier rounds, that didn't make them less. Because joy doesn't always demand a stage. And legacy doesn't require a closing scene. Sometimes, it just lingers, in the hush of the crowd when she enters, in the arc of a serve honed over decades, in the knowing glance exchanged between generations on the same court. Venus didn't leave the game. She simply became part of its design. Sometimes, legacy isn't what you win. It's who you became, while everyone watched, and especially when no one did. Venus lived that truth, not just on court, in front of thousands, but in quiet minutes, alone in training rooms, early in the morning, late into seasons where the sun didn't shine as brightly on her name. She kept evolving, not chasing reinvention, but growing into deeper versions of herself. Every loss became memory, every win, a meditation. She no longer needed validation. She had moved past being the first, past being Serena's sister. Past needing to be the center of attention. Now, her gaze widened toward impact. Toward legacy in motion. Young black girls with beads in their braids walked onto courts now without having to explain themselves. Because Venus had already done it. Athletes talked openly about chronic illness, about mental health, about fighting for pay equity. Because Venus had made those conversations real before they were trending. She never called herself a role model. But she became one, by never shrinking, by never bending to fit. By letting her complexity stretch all four corners of the frame, champion, designer, builder, caretaker of her own becoming. She aged gracefully, not by avoiding change, but by meeting it with open palms. She wore age like armor. Experience like a quiet perfume. Venus never rushed. And that's what made her timeless. As others searched for finish lines, she traced her own rhythm. Taking the long road, letting time deepen her craft, soften her spirit, and sharpen her principles. She built something slower, something rooted. Because in the blur of greatness, in the noise of highlights and headlines, Venus had always been listening to something else. Something steadier. And that's why her legacy wasn't held in one shining moment, or even 10. It was in the spaces between. In how she looked at a court and saw not pressure but peace. In how she carried herself, so tall, so still, that even silence seemed to nod in her direction. And as she stood toward the dusk of the game, not diminished but distilled, you could feel it. Some athletes graduate into memory. Venus transformed into meaning. Sometimes, the measure of a life isn't in what was achieved, but in what was made possible. Venus didn't just play tennis. She reshaped how it could look, who could play it, how they could be seen, what they were allowed to expect. The trophies were part of the story. The matches, the rivalries, the records, yes. But they were never the whole thing. Because what lingered long after the headlines faded was her posture. The steadiness. The way she stood when it was unpopular. The silence she held when the world pushed for spectacle. The consistency, not always in results, but in presence. There are children, now grown, who picked up rackets because they saw her do it first. There are businesses built by women who watched her navigate rooms that weren't made to welcome her. There are conversations happening now, about fairness, about visibility, about strength, that started with her simply walking in. She never needed to call herself a pioneer. The court did it for her. In the lines she crossed. In the barriers she didn't just break but refused to acknowledge as valid in the first place. She lived what others still try to define. And through it all, through illness, pressure, victory, and obscurity, Venus remained intact, uncompromised, not as a symbol but as a person. A tall girl from Compton who chose quiet when she could have chosen noise. Who shared grace without asking who had earned it. Who kept showing up, not for applause, but for the love of the game, and for what that love might teach the world about patience, about ownership, about endurance. She didn't need to climb higher to know she had changed the view. Didn't need to win again to know she had redefined the word. She taught us that greatness isn't always loud, isn't always sudden, isn't always followed by exclamation points. Sometimes, it's just a steady presence. A long walk forward on a narrow path, until that path becomes a road. And others start walking too. Venus didn't just win, she remained.